After you've finished the first dungeon inside the big tree, you make like Joseph Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces and cross the threshold, leaving the cloistered environment of the Kokiri Forest. On the way out, Link's green-haired bestie, Saria, gives him the fairy ocarina as a parting gift, allowing the player to start acquiring the ocarina songs that are used for various purposes across the game. Now, you're finally ready to start making your first steps into the wider world. At which point, you have to talk to an owl for a little bit. We can talk about the owl later. For now, we'll talk about the first steps taken into the wider world, the vast green plain of Hyrule Field. And what a field it is! A big, beautiful, and mostly empty field. I'll address the mostly empty part soon, but first I want to talk about the field's layout. Hyrule Field is a hub connecting to the spokes that comprise the major regions of the game world. You'll cross over it many times throughout the game, first on foot, and then, if you play your cards right, on horseback. This first impression of Hyrule Field is particularly interesting to me. You emerge from Kokiri Forest into this constrained area between two high walls of rock, which opens up to the wide green expanse in a moment of visual splendor that really sells the feeling of a grand adventure in a massive world. I would also like to take a moment to appreciate, specifically, this static view you get, standing right at the gate to the field proper. You have a tree to your left and a tree to your right, framing the view, a classic touch. A slanted green hill with a dirt path stretches out in front of you. While you can see an imposing-looking mountain off to the east, the dirt path is flanked with small trees that draw your attention to the north. You run up the dirt path, the mountain still looming over you on your right side, and you start to see a spire rise above the horizon, and then, all at once, below the spire, you begin to make out the shape of a castle wall. This is Hyrule Castle, home of Princess Zelda, and it's your destination. Maybe the luster has worn off of Ocarina of Time, what with it being, as of this writing, a quarter of a century old. But I still think this walk from Kokiri Forest to Hyrule Castle is breathtaking, and it's all comprised of simple elements, like the slope of a hill and the monolithic shape of a distant castle. Granted, the technical details are relevant here too. Ocarina of Time ran on the Nintendo 64, a video game console that had much more impressive technical specs than its contemporaries. But even among its peers on the same console, Ocarina of Time was considered especially impressive. No other games at the time had individual areas that were this big and complex. No other game let you look this far into the distance. I like Ocarina of Time and the Legend of Zelda series a whole bunch, but I try to temper my praise with the understanding that it's not just some Nintendo magic that gives the spark to these games. There's also the power of capital. I would be hopelessly out of my depth trying to explain the exploitation that happens in every link in the capitalist chain that eventually gives us a cool video game. But I can at least say this. The difference between a seminal work like Ocarina of Time and a legendary flop like, I don't know, Bubsy 3D, made by the studio that would eventually make Days Gone, by the way, is not a result of the intelligence, talent, or passion of the teams making them. So much of Ocarina of Time's appeal, when it released in late 1998, was how impressive it was. Given the time and resources that Nintendo had, however, I can imagine that a lot of other studios could have created something equally impressive. I don't say this to disparage Ocarina of Time, just to acknowledge that popularity and influence are not equivalent to worth. As we drift ever further away from November of 1998, we also drift away from a time when Hyrule Field was a self-evidently impressive exhibition of cutting-edge technology. What we are left with, however, is still visually impressive in its own way. Its composition stands the test of time. That being said, Hyrule Field certainly is not dense of content. There simply isn't much to do here other than walk from one end to another. And from a particular formalist perspective, you could say that Hyrule Field is just a waste of time. I like good content density as much as the next queen, so I speak from experience when I say that anyone who plays Ocarina of Time for a while will quickly grow bored of Hyrule Field. But I would still offer the defense that density of content isn't the point of this area. Hyrule Field is there to add a sense of scale to the adventure. Scale in video games is an interesting thing to talk about because you can't really say anything for sure. For example, how tall is Link? Trick question. It depends on how big your TV is. If that answer doesn't satisfy you, well, you can simply assume that Link is the average height of a 12-year-old boy, or something like that. But without being given any kind of official data, we can only operate in the realm of assumption. Every time a new open world game comes out, there are articles talking about how big their world is in terms of kilometers or miles, and the way they find these measurements comes through assumptions. A quick Googling tells us that the world of Elden Ring is 79 square kilometers. Well, it is if you're assuming that the player character is 170 centimeters tall. I think it's pretty cool and impressive the way that fans do this, but it creates a bit of a conundrum. Viewed in terms of kilometers, most game worlds are much smaller than they should be. The aforementioned Elden Ring, for example, fits multiple warring kingdoms into an area that is slightly smaller than that of the city of Nampa, Idaho. This compression of large spaces is a well-known and oft-remarked upon quirk of the scale of video game worlds. There are additional wrinkles, however. Video game spaces aren't just compressed. Small spaces, things like houses, are expanded in all sorts of odd ways in order to make them easier for a player character to interact with. Ceilings are higher, hallways are wider, doorways are bigger, furniture is further apart. Most games that differentiate between exteriors and interiors feature interiors that are much bigger than they appear on the outside. Anyway, what this all adds up to is that space in games is not conveyed in a way that you can directly translate to real-world units of measurement. So you could say that, with a world totaling about 5 square kilometers, you could fit 15 Ocarina of Times into one Elden Ring, and still have space left over. And that's cute and all, but from an artistic perspective, I don't think that this approach is as helpful for understanding video game scale as unpacking the specific techniques that are used to convey scale. Hyrule Field conveys Ocarina of Time's scale in a few ways. The emptiness of Hyrule Field focuses the mind on the sensation of traveling and the feeling of seeing a distant destination become bigger as you approach. Hyrule Field excels at making areas look enticing from afar, just as much as it excels at making them emerge suddenly over the horizon. The terrain is hilly, only being completely flat in a handful of places. Visually, this gives the terrain a sense of motion even when you're standing completely still. In more tactile terms, even the simple act of pressing forward on the joystick can have a unique texture depending on where you are in Hyrule Field. The action remains the same, but there's a tangible difference in how it feels for Link to run up a hill, to run down a hill, and to meet the level ground at the foot of a hill. This doesn't directly make the world feel bigger, but it adds a feeling of resistance to the terrain that has a similar effect. The day-night cycle also creates a sense of scale. Time only passes in certain circumstances. It stands still, locked into either day or night when you're in areas like towns or dungeons, but it passes between day and night when you're in an area like Hyrule Field. I would imagine technical limitations play a part in this odd, partitioned implementation, but I also think there's a deliberate artistic choice being made here to only have the day-night cycle feature in the parts of the game where it would be the most audio-visually interesting. It isn't present for the sake of verisimilitude. It's present because it adds a layer of drama to exploring certain parts of the world. A full 24 hours in-game lasts only 230 seconds, so a lot of in-game time seems to pass as Link makes his way from point A to point B. For the player, it's just a leisurely stroll from Kokiri Forest to Hyrule Castle. For Link, it's an arduous journey that takes an entire day. Now, despite whatever dramatic flair it may add, this day-night cycle isn't a system that's developed in much depth. 230 seconds is fast to the point of absurdity. Look at the moon's streak across the sky like it's in some kind of hurry, but it has to be fast, because the day-night cycle's primary gameplay purpose is to cause the player minor inconveniences, like causing them to wait for shops to open in the morning, or waiting until night to do certain side quests, and, to a certain formalist perspective, that's pretty pointless. It would be easy to dismiss this criticism by saying that the 230-second long cycle is so short as to be negligible, or you could mention the Sun's Song, an ocarina song which allows the player to freely switch from day to night and night to day. You can acquire this song pretty early in the game, so technically even the minor inconvenience of the day-night cycle can be obviated soon after it's first encountered. But I don't want to dismiss this criticism, because I think it's fundamentally pretty reasonable to see all of this as pointless friction. I just appreciate what the day-night cycle adds to the game dramatically. Let me highlight a specific example example. The first time you step foot onto Hyrule Field, the in-game clock will be at 12 p.m., halfway through the day, with 6 in-game hours until night falls. This gives you about 75 seconds to get from Kokiri Forest to Hyrule Castle Town, which is possible, but you would really have to be hauling ass. A new player, even one who heeds the advice of the multiple characters telling them to rush straight to Hyrule Castle, is liable to see the drawbridge cruelly pulled up before their very eyes, locking them out for the night. How could they do that? What are they so worried about keeping out? So this new player will likely stay put, waiting for daylight. That's when they get a nasty surprise. In a truly horrifying twist, not one, but 2 skeletons pop out. It's a narrative moment that has arisen organically out of game mechanics, where Link, having run out into the world with a spring in his step, has an unexpected brush with how harsh the world can be. But the story doesn't end there. If you ask your fairy companion Navi about these monsters, she'll tell you that they're called Stal Children, and tell you not to fear them. She's right. Spooky and scary as these skeletons may be, you can avoid them with your eyes closed, by running in circles, or even just in a straight line. Even if you face them head-on, you'll find them simple to dispatch, with their slow, shuffling movements and their generously telegraphed, easily avoided attacks. Now, this is just one possibility. The player doesn't have to run straight towards Hyrule Castle. There's a whole lot of Hyrule Field you might want to look at before that. There's only one thing standing in your way, and it has feathers. I was a very obedient child. I'll spare you all the anecdotes about all the complexes I picked up and all the bizarre things I did out of some bullheaded desire to obey authority figures. But I will say this, for the longest time, I didn't understand why people don't like Kaepora Gaebora the owl in this big, scary, and confusing world. A world where it's so easy to lose your way. Who cares if some owl spends a little too long pointing you in the right direction? Now, I'm an adult, and my contempt for authority has jeopardized my employment on numerous occasions, and now I understand a little bit better. I spoke earlier of how impressive the first steps onto Hyrule Field are, but I downplayed the role Kaepora Gaebora plays in that moment. Namely, he kills the momentum completely. Right as you're approaching that initial framed view of Hyrule Field, you'll encounter a big owl sitting on the branch of one of the trees framing that view. This owl's name is Kaepora Gaebora, and he has some things to tell you. He tells you to go see Princess Zelda. The player hardly needs to be told this a second time, as the Great Deku Tree had used the last scraps of carbon dioxide in his arboreal lungs to tell you the exact same thing not even 5 minutes earlier. After finishing the dungeon inside the Great Deku Tree, he explains the player's mission. The Great Deku Tree had been cursed by a wicked man from the desert named Ganondorf. Ganondorf seeks control of the Triforce, a set of magical golden triangles left behind by the 3 goddesses after they created the world. Though Link fought valiantly to save him, the Great Deku Tree's wounds from the curse were too deep, and he dies shortly after entrusting Link with the spiritual stone of the forest, the Kokiri Emerald, and also telling Link to seek out Princess Zelda at Hyrule Castle so that they can stop Ganondorf together. This earliest portion of the game conspicuously constrains the player within the confines of Kokiri Forest. Gaining the ability to leave feels freeing, but it's tinged with sadness, as it comes with the death of the Great Deku Tree. There's also a small amount of guilt, as Saria stops Link right before he leaves, to give him her beloved fairy Ocarina and to remind him to come back sometime to visit. The cutscene with the Great Deku Tree is a visually impressive depiction of a creation myth that is also a scene where a parental figure dies. The cutscene with Saria comes shortly after, and while briefer and more subtle, still packs some emotion into the small space of the wooden bridge leading to Kokiri Forest's exit. These are solid story beats in their own right, but also serve the secondary purpose of getting the player wound up and ready to be let loose into the wide open world. But instead of letting this moment breathe, instead of letting the player take in their surroundings, you have to listen to a long-winded spiel from an owl, where he reiterates the simple instructions to find Princess Zelda at Hyrule Castle. He also explains how to access the world map. Thanks. Once he's said his spiel, he has the audacity to ask you if you need him to repeat himself. And if you're just mashing the A button to get through his dialogue, you'll accidentally select the option to confirm that you do need him to repeat himself. And sure, that's mildly funny once you understand that it's a deliberate joke at the player's expense. But even making the big assumption that it does land as a joke, it is a mildly funny moment that undermines the more important feeling of grandeur. I mentioned how great this framed shot of Hyrule Field is, where you can see a road stretching out in front of you and a mountain in the distance. This is the view that Kaepora Gaebora takes you away from, and once he flies away, the camera swings towards this scenic view of a wall off to the side, at which point you have to manually reorient the camera in order to get Link running back in the same direction he was going before he was so rudely interrupted. Most of the time, I end up reorienting the wrong way and end up running back towards Kokiri Forest. It has the cadence of flubbing a stage direction in a stage play. So despite all the work that's been put into this first impression of Hyrule Field, we're still off to an inauspicious start. But okay, the owl is dealt with. Once you've actually gotten into Hyrule Field proper, you have some freedom to wander around for a bit. Aside from going north to Castletown, the intended way forward, 4 new areas open up to you. Lon Lon Ranch in the center of Hyrule Field, Kakariko Village to the northeast, Lake Hylia to the south, and Gerudo Valley to the west. There is a non-trivial amount of stuff to do, too. You can collect 5 pieces of heart, which is 1 more than the 4 needed to add another heart container to your life meter. All it takes is a little bit of poking around in Lon Lon Ranch, playing a grave digging minigame in Kakariko Village's graveyard, playing the fishing minigame at Lake Hylia, finding a way down to this ledge on the side of Gerudo Valley, and finally, the last one is found by backtracking through Kokiri Forest and heading into the Lost Woods to play music with some forest imps. You can also make substantial headway on one of the other major side quests, hunting gold skulltulas. There are about a dozen that you can find before even stepping foot inside of Castletown, more than enough to unlock the first reward, a bigger wallet so that Link can carry more money. You can also round up 7 of the chicken-like cuckoo birds in Kakariko Village to get an ever-useful glass bottle, one of the 4 bottles available in the game. This is a satisfying amount of freedom to have this early in the game. But there is a catch. The entire time you're exploring, you will be nagged by Kaepora Gaebora, who zealously guards the entrances to Kakariko Village, Lake Hylia, and Gerudo Valley, armed with words that you have to sit through before proceeding. At the entrance to Lake Hylia, he leaves permanently after giving his explanation, but he will resume his posts near Kakariko Village and Gerudo Valley every time you re-enter Hyrule Field, ready to lecture you again. He gives some basic world-building information. Well, with Kakariko Village, all he gives you is the name, but when you encounter him near Gerudo Valley, he explains that it's the site of a gang of thieves. When you encounter him near Lake Hylia, he introduces the fish-like Zora people who guard the sunken water temple at the bottom of the lake. He appears again on an island on Lake Hylia, but this time he doesn't interrupt the player. You have to make the active decision to talk to him, at which point he gives another explanation of Lake Hylia, the Zora people, and the water temple, before asking if you want him to carry you to Hyrule Castle. When you encounter him near Gerudo Valley, he explains that it's the location of a hideout of a gang of thieves, and then passive-aggressively says that you're free to go wherever you want. Oh, and how could I forget that in the 2 appearances he makes near Lake Hylia, he feels compelled to, again, remind you how the world map works, subtly hinting that you've gone in the wrong direction. His appearances at this specific stage of the game could be considered helpful for orienting the player and for fleshing out the world. In practice, though, having to listen to all the things a big owl hoots at you almost every time he sees you, most of which end up amounting to a reminder that you should be heading north to Hyrule Castle, just makes it feel like the game is nagging you. The fact that he also offers you a ride at one point helps a little, as does the fact that if you squint, you can kinda tell that his character is supposed to be a bit of a joke, but the primary impression he gives is being unnecessary friction. Of course, it doesn't help that he's only one of 2 characters in Ocarina of Time whose main purpose is to nag the player. There's also Link's fairy companion, Navi. Navi has a few purposes, some of which are more helpful than others. Her primary purpose is to serve as an in-universe justification for the Z targeting mechanic. Navi flies over to enemies, characters, and points of interest, acting as a sort of reconnaissance drone. When she flies over to enemies, she gives the option to read a short description of the enemy. When she flies over to characters, you can talk to them at a distance. When she flies over to points of interest, she offers hints. This is all helpful
helpful functionality. She also periodically reminds the player what they're doing. Shortly after loading your save file, she'll remind you what your current objective is. This is mildly helpful, but she has to wait a few seconds after the file is loaded to say anything, rather than just having the information right from the start, which strikes me as a little strange. She also gives these same reminders over the course of normal gameplay, at an interval that I can only really describe as unclear. This is where we start to get into the feeling of being nagged by Navi. Even for players with cognitive or intellectual disabilities or other kinds of neurodivergence that might cause them to lose track of their objectives in the middle of a single play session, Navi's reminders are usually pretty vague, and they come up too irregularly to be helpful in their own right. You can technically talk to Navi at will, but only after obtaining Saria's song. That song is normally used to telepathically contact Link's green-haired bestie, who has her own advice and commentary. But if you choose not to talk to Saria, Navi will ask if you want to talk to her instead. So we have two intertwined issues. There's some redundancy in having at least 3 different helper characters, whose roles aren't strongly distinguished, even if they do have distinct personalities. And we have a bizarre, user-unfriendly interface for contacting one of these 3 characters, the only one of whom is at your side at all times. Anyway, everything listed so far involves situations where the player is choosing to talk to Navi. Even if she pipes up with an obnoxious voice clip,
Hey, listen, watch out, hello, look.
even if the little flashing icon that tells you she has something to say is annoying, you can ignore her in both cases. But there are times when you simply have to listen to her. Sometimes she'll stop the whole game in its tracks to tell you something. She does this 3 times in the dungeon inside the Great Deku Tree, for example. First to explain that these walls with vines on them can be climbed, then a little later to explain that the multi-purpose A button can be used to open doors, then a little later to explain that the multi-purpose A button can be used to push and pull big blocks of stone. She persists in doing this kind of thing periodically across the entire rest of the game. This advice is rarely necessary, as it usually involves things that players could easily figure out on their own. At bare minimum, it's unnecessary to stop the game in its tracks to give these basic explanations. As long as the game clearly establishes what button you press to answer her calls, she could simply dispense her wisdom the same way she always does, with that flashing icon. Navi the Fairy and Kaepora Gaebora the Owl are well-intentioned efforts to orient the player in a potentially overwhelming 3D world, but they run into a whole host of issues with what kinds of information they choose to prioritize, and how they often interrupt the game in order to deliver this information. These are problems the developers were aware of, and took efforts to fix in subsequent games, to varying degrees of success. I try to avoid making broad declarations of what I think are popular perceptions of Ocarina of Time, and other games in the Legend of Zelda series, but I think it's fair to say that Navi and Kaepora Gaebora have cast a long shadow. Ocarina of Time marked the start of an era of Legend of Zelda games that ended at some point in the 2010s. That is to say, an era where Legend of Zelda games spent a lot of time interrupting the player in order to explain things to them. The fairy and the owl are some of the most obvious representatives of this. That is at least one popular perception of the series. And while I am a tremendously annoying person who disagrees with a lot of the finer points involved in this perception, I've definitely come to understand what makes this constant interruption so frustrating. There is a similar but not identical discussion to be had about how the Legend of Zelda series' approach to player freedom changed, starting with the very open-ended original game, but broadly becoming more restrictive as the series went on, at least until some point in the 2010s. I actually think Ocarina of Time has a more open-ended design than is immediately obvious, but Navi and Kaepora Gaebora's interventions go a long way to disguising this. Even if, in concrete terms, they don't do anything to restrict your freedom, their combined effect is to make the game feel more annoying, to make you feel like you're constantly having control taken away from you, particularly early on, and that leaves the impression that the game is more restrictive than it actually is. Setting all of that aside, if you intend to continue the game past this initial foray into Hyrule Field, you will have to listen to the advice of Navi the Fairy and Kaepora Gaebora the Owl at some point. You will have to make your way up to Hyrule Castle and meet Princess Zelda.
The process of getting up to the courtyard of Hyrule Castle, where you meet Zelda for the first time, makes for a good opportunity to talk about Ocarina of Time's genre, action-adventure. This doesn't mean the same thing for video game genre as it would for another medium's genre. A movie like 1982's Conan the Barbarian is an action-adventure movie because it follows the adventures of a guy who fights in action scenes. A game like the 1990 US version of the 1987 Japanese adaptation of 1981's Wizardry, Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord, also involves the adventures of characters who fight in action scenes. But it's a dungeon crawler role-playing game, not an action-adventure game. Action-adventure is a video game genre term that's used a little too broadly, in my opinion. Just Google action-adventure games if you want to see what I mean. But I think there is a useful definition of the term, and the Legend of Zelda series provides a particularly clear vision of what the genre is to me.
It's important to understand the component genres, action and adventure. Action is the simpler of the two to explain. It's a very wide descriptor that applies to games that are primarily played in real time, and involves some amount of reflex-based challenge. The titular character of Flicky is not an action hero, but the game bearing her name is an action game. Adventure is a bit trickier to pin down, and I think it would clarify a lot to point out that the word is not chosen for its dictionary definition, but because the progenitor of the genre was a game called Colossal Cave Adventure. So the adventure genre refers to games that are descendants of a game called Adventure. Video essayist Ian Danskin of the YouTube channel Innuendo Studios has a video that explains the twisty lineage of the very diverse adventure genre in depth. To sum up his conclusion, adventure games aren't defined by their mechanics the way most video games are. Rather, adventure games are defined by their focus on authoring unique moments in order to tell a story. Exploring the mundane setting of Gone Home doesn't create an adventurous feeling. It is literally the main character's home. But Gone Home is an adventure game because its mechanics, the first-person navigation, and the way you can pick up objects and move them around are used to create bespoke moments that tell a specific story. An action-adventure game, by my definition, is a game that uses the dynamic mechanics of an action game to create the scripted narrative moments of an adventure game. So, to bring it back to Ocarina of Time, this is part of what makes it so difficult for me to talk about this game in a succinct way. If it was just an action game, I could talk about the general feeling of playing it. If it was just an adventure game, I could talk about the general construction of the story. But Ocarina of Time tightly intertwines its mechanics and its storytelling, and neither part makes much sense without the context of the other. You can see the interplay of dynamic action elements and scripted adventure elements here in the run-up to Hyrule Castle. To get behind the gates, you have to sneak past a few stationary guards. Now, Ocarina of Time isn't a fully featured stealth game, so this is a simple sequence. You just want to avoid being right next to a guard, or falling within their narrow range of sight. Simple as it may be, it's still handled dynamically in real time, out of a small set of predictable mechanical interactions. In other words, it's handled through action mechanics. As a side note, the way you avoid getting spotted by the guards is by deliberately avoiding whatever seems like the most obvious path forward. Even if the implementation is pretty simple, the game is calling for the player to deliberately subvert their burgeoning understanding of how the game constructs its environments, and I think that's interesting in its own right. Anyway, once you're behind the gates, you have to move some blocks to jump into a hole in the castle wall. Before you can do this, you have to deal with the man sleeping right in the most inconvenient location possible. His name is Talon, and he's the owner of Lon Lon Ranch, which sits at the center of Hyrule Field. His daughter, Malin, is back near Castletown and is worried about him. She gives you an egg, which hatches into a cuckoo overnight. Pull the cuckoo out near Talon and it cacaws, waking him up, giving you the space to finish pushing around the blocks, which grants access to the inside of Hyrule Castle. This moment with Talon and the cuckoo highlights the adventure elements because it's based on scripted interactions. Compare this to the Legend of Zelda game that would release a little more than 18 years after this game. In Breath of the Wild, creatures sleeping and waking up is a consistent mechanic that appears throughout the game, and must be constantly accounted for. In Ocarina of Time, waking a character up isn't a mechanic, nor is hatching cuckoos from eggs. They're just one-off things that you do here, in this specific moment, for the narrative purpose of introducing you to some more characters. Once you get inside the castle walls, you progress through a series of gardens, again sneaking past guards like you did outside. This is marginally more complicated than before, because this time the guards are moving, but it's still pretty breezy. I use these two adjacent stealth sequences as examples of dynamic action gameplay to contrast against the scripted adventure gameplay of Waking Up Talon, but the stealth is action-driven only in a loose sense. More than an exercise in skill-based gameplay, these stealth sequences are a quick and simple way of creating a narrative moment. You're narrowly avoiding some dull-witted, fun-hating goons as you dart through a beautiful green garden filled with hedges and marble statues. It's all silly, classic children's story stuff, underscored by the mischievous woodwind and strings melody playing in the background. As an action sequence, it's mechanically realized in a pretty bare-bones way, rising only slightly above the bare minimum due to a cute, brief moment of risk-reward in the middle, where the player is tempted to stray from a safe path into the patrol path of a guard in order to collect a few rupees. It's just a single moment, but it enriches the playful tone. The stakes of all of this have to feel real in the sense that there has to be some fail state. If you're seen by the guards, you're thrown out and have to start over. But the sequence is simple and easy because that's the most effective way to convey the intended lighthearted tone of sneaking into your friend's house without her dad knowing. It puts the player in a light and airy mood as they walk into the castle courtyard, ready to introduce Link to his posh new friend, Princess Zelda. I like this whole sequence because I like the way Ocarina of Time tells its story. You could make a case, however, that this is all just an unnecessary detour that detracts from the exploratory gameplay. In a video released in 2014, YouTuber and guy who says slurs Egoraptor makes this exact argument. He argues that the game needlessly restricts the amount of space you can explore in order to force this first meeting with Zelda. Specifically, there is a locked gate in Kakariko Village, a gate leading to Death Mountain, the area where you find the game's second dungeon. A guard stands next to this gate and tells you no kids allowed. If you were to set the game's story aside, the reason why you visit Zelda is just to get a letter giving a royal decree to this guard to open that gate.
Egoraptor says that the game's sense of adventure would have been better served if the gate had just been open to begin with. Now, this Egoraptor video is almost 10 years old at this point, and I have no need to attack it in order to defend the honor of what is, according to Metacritic, objectively the best game ever made. I've actually come to the conclusion that he's articulating a pretty coherent, reasonable take, and no amount of nitpicking about the specifics of his argument is going to change that. I just think we appreciate different aspects of Legend of Zelda games. This stealth sequence isn't just a detour from exploring.
It's a way of introducing three characters. There is the series' titular character, Princess Zelda, as well as her caretaker, the foxy ninja known as Impa, and, most importantly, the weirdo guard in front of the gate to Death Mountain. This guard belittles Link for being a child, reckoning that a child probably shouldn't be running around a mountain called Death Mountain. Even when complying with Princess Zelda's order to open up the gate, he laughs it off as some kind of childish game. But he also gives Link a valuable tip, that his wooden Deku shield is liable to burn up, and that he should invest in a metal shield. If Link goes to Castletown and buys one, the shopkeeper, who's friends with the guard, gives Link a discount. The guard also asks Link for a favor. He hasn't had the time off of work to get his son the mask of a popular character, a yellow fox named Keaton, whose face bears no small amount of resemblance to Pikachu. This introduces a side quest where Link has to sell masks to a handful of people. In the case of the Death Mountain gate guard, when Link sells him the Keaton mask, he says that his son will love it, and then promptly puts it on his own face, where it will remain for the rest of the game. So, what exactly is his deal? Was he lying about having a son son? Why did he feel the need to tell this lie if he was just gonna start wearing the mask for the whole world to see? I don't know, but this is a charmingly offbeat character, and I'm glad the game included him. Taken on purely mechanical terms, the act of sneaking into Hyrule Castle is, at best, mildly entertaining. It's hardly exciting as a test of mechanical skill, but it plays a valuable part in the story that Ocarina of Time is telling, and while at times I can criticize aspects of that storytelling, whether it be the gameplay mechanics or anything else, I think the game is well justified in spending time on it, because Ocarina of Time is an adventure game, and because story is what adventure games are about.
Thanks for watching, everybody. Please consider leaving a comment about any of my... Thanks for watching, everybody. Please remember to like and comment with any aspect of... I'm so bad at calls to action. Just fucking, I don't know. Leave a comment, subscribe to me on Patreon or something. I have my Patreon linked in the description. I've been recording for so long, and I've been wearing these shoes the whole time, and they're not even visible. I just think they're cute, and I like wearing them, but my ankles hurt. Like, comment, subscribe. Support me on Patreon if you have the money for it. Okay. Bye. Thank you for watching.